you everyone for joining us for this webinar on intentional teaching and sustained shared thinking. And thanks particularly to our two experts tonight. We have Dr. Tara McLaughline, who's Senior Lecturer at Massey University's Institute of Education, where she's committed to supporting learning environments that promote diverse and equitable opportunities for children and families. And we also have Associate Professor Sue Cherrington, who's from the School of Education in Victoria University of Wellington. And her recent research has been focused on professional learning communities and pedagogical practices. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for the invitation.
Mm-hmm. So we're talking about intentional teaching and sustained shared thinking. Before I open the floor for questions tonight, I think we will just work through what these concepts mean. So let's begin with intentional teaching. What is intentional teaching, and how might we recognise intentional teaching? Okay, who would like to start?
Where you go, Tara?
All right.
You take the lead on this one, and I'll take the lead on sustained shared thinking.
I'll open up. I think in the broadest sense, intentional teaching is being thoughtful, it's being purposeful, it's being deliberate, it's being planful about the things that we do to support children's learning. And it's recognizing that in the context of play-based environments, there's a real role for the teacher to get involved in children's learning and be quite intentional, or we can use the word deliberate, on the supports that we're providing to children. And that can include everything from the learning goals that we have for children, the times we're choosing to support them, the ways we choose to support them, and how we sort of assess their learning and monitor their progress. And just being very mindful of all those things and making sure that they're at the forefront of our thinking and not an afterthought in response to things that happen during the day. So that would be kind of the broadest sense of intentional teaching.
So to add on to that, I think for both of us, we see intentional teaching very much situated and located in relational and responsive teaching. So it's not about not doing the kind of teaching that we've often been talking about in early childhood in terms of having those really strong relationships with children and being highly responsive to them. So sometimes one way of thinking about intentional teaching is to think about what it's not. And we're not talking about heavily teacher-directed teaching, and we're not talking about didactic teaching. So we're talking about teaching alongside children that's based in their interests and what's engaging them, and it's finding the moments within those interactions to be able to support and extend and elaborate on what children are doing in order to strengthen the learning possibilities that are happening there for children. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it means that when we're being intentional, sometimes it means that we're choosing not to interact with the child. Sometimes you're observing and you're thinking, no, this is the moment for me to step back. But more often it's about us actually being quite deliberate about doing something. So there's a lot of thinking in the moment that happens, a lot of reflecting and action that happens in intentional teaching.
One of the things I like about what Sue said was sometimes it's easier to define it by what it's not. It's not that didactic teaching, it's not rote teaching. But I think what's really important, particularly in early childhood, is that it is still a form of teaching. It's appropriate for teaching children and teaching young children in play-based settings, and it's sort of reclaiming the teaching word to our early childhood profession, where it's okay to be, it's okay to teach and it's okay to be a teacher. It's just the ways that we do it look different than they might do it in other aspects or other places in the education sector.
So some people listening might be wondering if intentional teaching is something that kind of goes alongside, the child-centred environments and curriculums that, are just the cornerstone of ECE. So how would you respond to that?
I think we'd both say absolutely. What we're talking about is teaching that's situated within play-based, child-centred learning situations. So it's about working alongside children. It's around being engaged with children in the everyday situations and activities and events that happen in an early childhood setting, whether it's a centre setting or a home-based one. So we're talking very much about taking children's learning and taking their interests and their play as the starting point, and then thinking very carefully about how do we build upon that? How do we add into in very thoughtful and responsive kind of ways, so that we just keep building. And it's around being aware of where children are at in their play, in their thinking, in their learning. And so, to use Vygotsky's words, thinking about children's zone of proximal development and thinking about, so what do I need to be doing to support children to go beyond what they can do independently and without support, to be able to do something with our support. And they're not necessarily enormous, big steps. Often it's very subtle, very small shifts that we're supporting children with through the way in which we provide that support.
Mm-hmm. I'd also say it kind of involves a mix of different play types and learning support types. So when people think about child-centered or child-led play, very often they're thinking about a truly free play, unstructured, let children do what they want when they want. And it's not that we can't support children's learning intentionally in those settings, but we might also add a mix of the occasional adult-guided, still playful learning activity. We might work into children's initiated activities and provide a little bit of an extension on that. So, but I think going back to defining it by what it's not the directive, totally structured teaching over here, but it's not a free-for-all of children doing what they want all the time, anytime they want it. It's finding that blend of different ways for children to be engaged in playful activities and supported learning activities that build on their own interests and build on the things that matter to them.
And I think intentional teaching sits very, very comfortably within a sociocultural approach to learning and teaching, because we know that within a sociocultural approach there is there's an active role for the teacher. So we're not just about setting up the environment and then letting children go off and be the lone explorers, as we might have done when we were more influenced by Piagetian approach. It is very much about us engaging with children in order to co-construct understanding and meaning together. It's about us working quite actively alongside children. So it's a very appropriate approach for us to be taking as early childhood teachers.
And I would add to that also recognizing in education and care settings and teacher-led center-based settings, or any actually of our early childhood settings, our responsibilities to the curriculum framework, to Fariki, and making sure children experience the breadth and depth of the learning outcomes across our strands. And so creating those opportunities for children to have the range of learning experiences even when they're not self-initiating them, and making sure that children really are getting a complete experience in their learning opportunities, as we've outlined in terms of the learning goals for children.
Absolutely. So it seems that quite a large, broad variety of things that teachers can be doing in being intentional with children's learning. Can we talk a little bit about this other term, sustained shared thinking? Mm-hmm. What is sustained shared thinking, and why is it an important pedagogical strategy?
Okay, so sustained shared thinking first really came into our early childhood vocabulary just after the beginning of the 21st century through a major research study that was undertaken in the UK, the researching effective pedagogy in the early years. But it has its foundations in the work that people like Bruner have been doing in the 80s around mother-infant dyads and the ways in which mothers often really up the ante for their children in terms of introducing new language and expanding on children's utterances, and it picks up on ideas around teachable moments and extending thinking in the moment, and also around around scaffolding. And so Surridge, Blatchford, Kingston and Malouche have defined it as instances where two or more individuals working together in an intellectual way to solve a problem, clarify a concept, evaluate activities, or extend a narrative. But both parties must contribute to the thinking and it must develop and extend. So it's very much around typically an adult, a teacher and a child, or a teacher and one or two children coming together and engaging in a sustained episode where they are equally engaged, so they're partners in that process, and the children, in particular the children's thinking, is extended through that process, and their thinking is elaborated on. So it's a sort of episode. It doesn't happen that frequently. In their study, I think in the excellence centres it was around 5 or 6%. One of the New Zealand studies that Anne Mead and colleagues did, I think they recognised it up to about 10% of the time. So it's not something that's going to happen every moment in any early childhood setting. But it happens most often in activities or experiences where children have chosen the activity and the adult has joined in with the children. So, and it happens most often with either a single child or with a small group of children.
And it really was the defining feature of the things that set the good and high quality settings apart in their longitudinal study in the UK from the other settings. They went in and basically did case studies of some of their good and excellent settings that just were performing better on all their measures of quality, as well as child outcome, positive child outcome measures. And they really identified that these were the kinds of interactions that were happening that really distinguish these settings from other settings. And I think the two things that Suraj talks about in terms of why these are so important, these types of interactions are so important, is because they support and promote children's language skills, right, and they support and promote children's thinking skills. And really, language and thinking are, intertwined skill sets, and we need to be building up children's oral language, but we also need to be building up their cognitive capabilities. And these types of interactions or episodes really seem to be quite powerful at doing both those things.
Okay, so how do teachers go about this? How do they enable sustained shared thinking? What kinds of things might a teacher do or say in order to prompt such a conversation or interaction?
That's a great question, and I'd like to say that Sue and I and some other colleagues have a research project on that at the moment. So we will have more for you on that at the end of our research project. But there are things coming out of the literature now that we can talk about. Okay.
So I think actually it starts very much around what a lot of teachers in a lot of early childhood settings in this country are already doing. It's around knowing your children really well, so that you know their interests, you know what, how they respond in different situations, you know what they get excited about, and then you've got an entry point into having those kind of deep engagements and deep interactions. It's about working with children's interests. It's about working in play context. So it's around setting up rich environment so that there is choice for children, there are interesting things, materials and resources for children to engage in, so that you have those things really as, if you like a base that then creates the opportunity or the space for you to be able to develop the deeper and ongoing kind of interactions. And one of the things that we've been thinking about, just before we get on to some of the particular interactive strategies, but is what are the sorts of things that might impact on sustained shared thinking and interrupt it or stop it from happening. And that's one of the areas that we've actually developed some particular measures in our research project to start trying to tease out what gets in the way of teachers engaging in sustained shared thinking. And is it too many interruptions, whether that's the way we've structured the program or just the usual interruptions that children provide for us. And if so, what can we do as teaching teams to kind of create space that when a teacher is in the moment of developing or starting an episode with children, that we support that teacher to be able to sustain it. So there's a whole lot of kind of structural and organisational things that I think pave the way for it to make it more easy for us to engage in sustained shared thinking. And then there's a whole lot of kind of teacher interactive strategies that we can use.
If I was to make a suggestions for teams and settings, the thing to do is just have it on your mind that it's important to get in there and connect with children and spend not just extended time with them, but extended time with them in a conversation that's meaningful, and trying to move past some of that everyday talk to talk that is more learning focused, to talk that is more thinking focused. And so, we're going to focus on what are some of the things that get in the way, but, what are some of the things that might create the opportunity is, on a day that, numbers are low, do we take that team member off the floor and go and do paperwork, or do we take that team member and spend that quality time on the floor having those more sustained and interactive conversations with children that make a difference for their learning? And so just reorienting our focus around what matters for supporting children's learning, language, and thinking.
So a lot of it, I think, is around our use of language, and it's around avoiding bombarding children with questions, but asking the open-ended questions and providing lots of wait time for children, particularly when we're asking questions that are kind of challenging about what do they think about a situation, or what do they think about an idea. Why do they think something might be happening? You're in the water trough, and why are the bubbles coming out of the bottle when you squeeze it?
I was just going to say, it's tempting to think, oh no, that question was obviously way over, and I'll just answer it myself, or I'll ask a different one.
Yeah. And teachers, we're all really good, speaking for myself included, we're really good at asking the question and then answer it a nanosecond later kind of thing. So it's about creating that space and time for children to collect their thoughts and to be able to think through and respond. And then it's around often pushing a little bit further. So a child kind of responds to that question about, why the bubbles, why we're creating bubbles when we squeeze the bottle, to asking the next question about it in terms of what do you think was in the bottle before the water started to get in there? So if there's air in there, how come when we squeeze it, why do you think it might be coming out? Lots of questions around thinking, around wondering, around hypothesizing, all of those sort of questions that encourage children to be able to share their ideas and to get them out and to talk about them. It doesn't matter if children's working theories are still emerging, and if they're in development, and they may not necessarily be the accepted scientific version of that particular working theory.
And a big part, I think, of that idea of eliciting children's thinkings and provoking their further thought is also not being afraid, not to answer every question that we pose, but to contribute to the thinking, some of our own ideas, some of our own wondering, to model and talk aloud about the thoughts that teachers are having and the way they're kind of processing it. So children can see and hear and be exposed to the thinking process and thinking ideas. And it is, every sustained shared thinking interaction, if we had a transcript of it, would look entirely differently. So it is this constant mixing of, and I think where Sue started, making sure we're not just firing questions, and that children have the opportunity to really be thoughtful and, do their thinking and give their responses, but then the series of strategies we use to continue to extend and build that is the key.
Thank you.
And it is a craft.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just building on that too, there's a concept that comes out of the professional development literature that I quite like, and that I think applies just as well to episodes of sustained shared thinking, and that's the idea about talking in rough draft speech rather than in final draft speech. So often when you're having those interactions with teachers, you don't quite know where it's going. You don't know all of the answers. You're often wondering and thinking yourself, but what we know from when teachers talk together is that when they talk in rough draft speech, it lets other people come into the conversation much more easily than if they talk in final draft speech, because it's a little bit tentative, it's a bit questioning. When we talk final draft speech, it's here's the answer, it's finished kind of thing. So I think it's absolutely fine for teachers to use rough draft speech all the time with children, in terms of that wondering, that stop starts, like sometimes maybe a little hesitant, kind of, I'm not sure about, maybe. Yeah, I think that's a really useful approach to use in terms of opening up conversation.
Well, thank you. I need to pause and just invite our audience to send in any questions that they have. It's been fascinating so far. For me, it sounds like sustained shared thinking is a lot about finding out about what children are thinking, and then kind of a process in which you're kind of feeding off each other. As you listen to a child's thoughts, it feeds into your own, and it's kind of like almost a little bit of a brainstorming might take place as well. I wondered what difference there would be then that you would see between sustained shared thinking and the process of co-constructing knowledge and ideas with children. Are these very similar processes?
I think so. I think what similar but slightly different, and what you were really just describing, I think, is possibly more like co-constructing. I think in an episode of sustained shared thinking, the teacher will still be entering that episode with some understanding of where the child is in their thinking at that stage, and so awareness of possibly their ZPD, or at least the beginning stages of their ZPD, their zone of
proximal development,
and so and has some intention in terms of, I want to strengthen I want the episode to be able to provide an opportunity to strengthen children's thinking, or elaborate their thinking in some way. So
perhaps more intentional.
So it is intentional in that sense, and it's not just accidental. I mean, there are often episodes that do happen quite spontaneously, but if teachers know their children really well and have been thinking about how they might be supporting their children's thinking, and their language development, then you're more likely to be able to pull on previous planning that you might have done for that child. So it can happen spontaneously. It can also happen in very sort of planful ways. But I think it does move beyond just happening coincidentally. So as teachers, we're aware of where children are up. Children become aware in the situation that we're talking about an area of knowledge or a skill, and that there are things for them to learn, and then we kind of actively co-construct that new knowledge together. But we both come into it aware of that this is a learning opportunity, if you like. So I think it does move beyond co-construction there.
Okay.
And I think, in many ways, co-construction is sort of the strategy you might use in specific episodes or in specific interactions. But with sustained shared thinking, I think we have larger goals like intentional teaching around language development, cognition and thinking, even supporting children's metacognition, that idea that they understand their own thinking and thoughts, and that, how thinking works. And so as a sort of pedagogical strategy, curricular strategy, we have kind of broader goals for it.
I just, one of our participants would like you just to go back, Sue, if you wouldn't mind, to the rough draft and final draft speech, and maybe, I found that really interesting too. So perhaps just some more examples.
Okay, so if we're speaking in a rough draft sense, it could be Tara and I having a conversation about something that's happening in one of our issues that might be happening, and we'll be talking it through, and if we're not really sure about what the issue is or where we might be going with it, there'll be some tentativeness in our talking. We'll be a little bit stop-start in that, and quite a bit of, well, I wonder if it might be about this, or it could possibly be that, or I'm sort of thinking, and it's tentative, and it just creates space for the other one of us to come into it. So if we translate that into thinking about a conversation with a child, and going back to the bubbles in the bottle and the water trough, if we use final draft speech, we might be sort of saying, now the reason that all the bubbles are coming out is that there's air in the bottle, and when we squeeze it, the air is forced out, and because air rises when it's in water, it's kind of the explanation, and it's finished. And there's not much for the child to say other than, oh, okay.
And there's no room for the working theories, which is such an important outcome for us.
So if we have more of a wondering style and some questions, but not too many, but some descriptive things, I can see some of those bubbles, they seem to be coming out really, really quickly when you push hard. I wonder why that is. I can't work out why they come out faster at some times than others. What do you think might be going on? This is a kind of off the top of my head example, but there's room for other perspectives to come in when we use rough draft speech. Final draft has a solution, has an answer, has an opinion, and it doesn't leave much room for other people.
It's finished.
Yeah.
And I think when working with children, that is so important, because they're very often taking their lead from sort of what, if the adult kind of closes the connection and says, this is what it is, they'll just, accept. And so creating that opportunity for that other thinking, that challenge, those other ideas is so important.
And I'm thinking, as I'm listening to you, that it's kind of almost trying to get rid of the is and turning it into a maybe. So this might be this, it might be that, and of this is, once you've said this is, like you say, it's finished, it's final. Okay, thank you, Sue. Another question about the environment and how that contributes to intentional teaching. Is there aspects of the environmental setup and the provocations that are provided that can best support intentional teaching?
I think a well-designed environment can absolutely help create and foster opportunities for intentional teaching. But ultimately, I think there is at the end of the day, that it comes down to the adult and their ability to get involved in the environment, in the play, in the learning areas. And I think a skilled interactionist can take a great learning environment and turn it into wonderful interactions. And a skilled interactionist can also take an average learning environment and still turn it into wonderful interactions. And so the environment absolutely is foundational to the opportunities we can create and provide for children to both take on their own and that we can support. But I think we can also, as intentional teachers, just take whatever environment we're working in and make really powerful learning opportunities for children through the way we involve ourselves in the interactions and in their play.
I think that's a really important point, because I think there is a danger sometimes of being more focused on the environment and maintaining things, making sure things are set up well for children, and actually not having the time for the conversations. So it's, as everything, a bit of a balance, I imagine. Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Sue.
I think if you look at Te Whāriki and you look at the, those 15 areas of practice under the kaioko responsibility, you see two kind of sets of practices. One is around the pedagogical framing, which is those things, that the pedagogical work that we do when we're not interacting with children. It's the work we do in our planning. It's the work we do with developing partnerships with parents and whānau. It's the environmental setup and our assessment work. That all needs to be intentionally thought about as well, because if we're not intentional in thinking about how we build partnerships with parents and whānau, then we miss out on a huge potential to support our actual interactions with children. And then you've got the actual pedagogical interactions as the other part of those kaioko responsibilities. So I think you do need both in order to get the best that you possibly can. But I'd agree with Tara that if I had to have one or the other, I'd rather have the high quality interactions in terms and a poor quality physical environment than because I think the high quality interactions will trump the poor physical environment any day. But ideally, I'd want to have both.
And when it comes to issue, the question was around the environment and intentional teaching. If we take that question, extend it to environment and sustained shared thinking,
Yes.
We're going to be doing some exploration in this in our work, but it may be that certain setups that are more open-ended, that are more exploratory, that create that opportunity for wonder are easier to get those types of conversations going in, versus setups that you might have an extended interaction, but the level of thinking never surpasses a certain point. But again, you could have a very skilled practitioner, skilled teacher, skilled kayako who is able, even in a kind of everyday environment, take the thinking up beyond a general interaction. But it may be that certain environmental arrangements and learning setups can create the opportunity to make that just easier to get started.
Mm. Yeah. And would it be possible, do you think, or worthwhile to be thinking about that a bit as you are planning environments? So thinking about and even planning for the questions and the wonderings, the rough draft speech that you plan to use in relation to this particular provocation or setup?
Absolutely. I think traditionally in early childhood we've been quite good in terms of planning experiences for children, thinking about how we'll set up the physical environment and the resources that we'll provide for children. We pay less attention to thinking about our actual interactive style and the strategies that we're going to use, the language that we're going to use. And it's very interesting. If you look at the original version of Te Whāriki, the only time the word teaching or teacher was mentioned was in relation to the links between Te Whāriki and school. It's teaching is much more prevalent now in the revised version. But if you look at Kei Tua Te Pai, you don't see teachers very much in any of the exemplars of assessments that are in there. And I think we've often left ourselves out of the loop in terms of thinking of the teacher and the active role that she or he has in interacting with children and the language that we use. As Tara said before, one of the key things around sustained shared thinking is supporting children's language development and their cognitive development, their conceptual understandings. And we do that very much through the interactions that we have with children, or the way that we create opportunities for them to have interactions with each other. So thinking about how the environment allows for small groups of children to easily kind of get together and explore things together. Thinking about how our organisation of the day allows for sustained periods of time for children to be engaged in exploration and play, because again we know that when play is more sustained, it has an opportunity to develop it into a deeper level of play than if it's constantly been interrupted. So we can be very planful around those things as well.
And just kind of building off that idea of one of the things we've done well is set up the environments and set provocations for children's experiences. I've been in so many settings that have these beautiful different learning areas set up, and they very often do have a little placard that is the provocation for children for that area. And I would love to see on the back of that placard that's facing children, just some notes to teachers that when they go into that area, that they can quickly turn over and remind themselves, that's some ways I could extend this or do that further thinking with children in this space. Building off what the child's doing, building off where the child has taken this learning. But it would be very neat to see that next level of thinking and planning as we set up for our environment. Absolutely.
I have a question here about how this works with infants and toddlers, and I'm assuming that and you'll have to put me right, that your question is more about sustained shared thinking than intentional teaching. I think that clearly we can be just as intentional with our goals for children's learning when we're interacting with and having those at the forefront of our mind when we're interacting with infants and toddlers. But does the term sustained shared thinking translate? How would that translate to working with infants and toddlers?
I don't think it has a direct it's not going to be quite the same, but some of the same ideas about what's important to support and build in children are the same. This idea of language and developing children's language, giving opportunities to infants and toddlers to build that idea of the back and forth communication and conversation, express themselves and be heard, as well as children become toddlers, teachers modeling their thinking and talking for children. And so the work that has come out of the UK and some of their sort of follow-up resources to support sustained shared thinking have been quite clear that some of the higher order, higher level thinking stuff that they're seeking to work on and promote isn't necessarily what we're doing with younger children. But that doesn't mean the things that sort of sit behind this aren't relevant for infants and toddlers. Another aspect of sustained shared thinking that they've been focusing on is the relational aspect between the teacher and child and supporting children's emotional well-being. And that's very relevant, obviously, for infants and toddlers, and having that secure attachment where children feel safe to engage in themselves. So would you add to?
Yeah, the two things I'd add, one is picking up on your idea around teachers talking about what's going on. So the way in which teachers working with infants and toddlers are often providing a commentary so that the language is being modelled and provided alongside the child's actions or the adult's actions, I think sits very, very comfortably within what we know about supporting sustained shared thinking. There was another one and it's just fallen out of my head. It's gone. Sorry. It'll probably come back later.
But yeah, assuming the question was focused on sustained shared thinking and infants and toddlers, we'd say it is a bit of we would shift it a little bit for a different meaning. But intentional teaching absolutely still applies all aspects of that dynamic.
And I've just remembered what it was, which was one of the things that we can do with any age child, but equally as well with infants and toddlers, is really fostering and encouraging that curiosity. And I mean, young children have toddlers are some of the most curious beings in the world. So creating opportunities where we foster that curiosity and that exploration, and then supporting with the language, to me, is creating the precursors for those episodes of sustained shared thinking. So it would be completely appropriate.
Yeah. Thank you. I think we've talked quite a lot tonight about sort of making the most of spontaneous opportunities to engage in these intentional sustained shared thinking episodes. Can you talk a little bit more about how sustained shared thinking could be planned for and deliberately orchestrated? You talked a little bit about having something on the back of some notes in an area for teachers, but he also talked about various play types, Tara, and you talked about how sometimes something that's adult initiated in response to children's interests could also be highly appropriate, highly intentional. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main areas that you can really get some really wonderful, rich, sustained shared thinking episodes is through storybook reading. And there are opportunities where children may initiate that they want to be read a story, but if children aren't initiating that, we wouldn't be encouraging teachers to be reading stories and just saying, oh, I'm reading this, this over here now for whoever wants to come join, because the opportunities to engage in conversation and dialogue with children about what's happening in the story, why might that be, what's going to happen next, make predictions and all those things. With every turn of the page, there is opportunities for teachers and children to be talking and thinking together.
That's a really good tip.
Yeah, and so storybook reading is just a great example of something that I think teams should be doing every day, a couple of times a day, to create those opportunities. And it builds children's oral language skills. It's supporting their emerging literacy. So many things, can be benefited from storybook reading.
I think one of the other ways in which we can also create opportunities is thinking very much, particularly for our children who are spending quite a long time each day in their early childhood setting, is how can we enable children to have a broader range of experiences. So can we be inviting people in on a regular basis, because that then creates opportunities not only for the conversation and the discussion in the moment of the visit, but for lots of follow-up conversations and recollections and connecting to children's lives outside of the setting, and how can we engage in lots of excursions around to places around our local community, and again to build on children's interests, so that we can we can be supporting children and giving them experiences that might be a little bit harder for us to have in the centre that are going to support those. And I think the other thing I think is also working really intentionally to build really strong partnerships with parents and whānau, because the more we know about what's happening in children's lives outside of the setting, the richer knowledge that we have at our fingertips to be able to draw on in the moment with those conversations with children. And if we connect and make connections with children, then I think we often open up lots of potential opportunities for really in-depth conversations.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And as you were talking, so I wondered about revisiting learning stories or other documentation as being kind of picking up on the idea of a story as well, Tara, but as being an opportunity to delve into children's thinking about those events, things that they've done. And one of our participants has offered the idea of getting children to talk about their art and things they've made, that she finds that often leads to sustained shared thinking. So thanks for that. Yeah.
I mean, and just in terms of thinking, children's ability to recognize things in the past, things in the present, things in the future. And so learning stories are a lovely thing to revisit for what were you thinking back then? What are you doing now? What are we going to do in the future? I mean, that's just a really nice tool for continuity of thoughts and planning.
And I guess one thing I'd add into that is that with the increased use of e-portfolios, I think often we're having to think about how do we manage that process. And I know lots of centres do both. They have their e-portfolio primarily looked at by parents and whānau, and then they reproduce the traditional hardback kind of one to have in the centre. But not everybody is necessarily doing that. And I think it's really important that we find ways for children to be able to revisit their portfolios in the centre, because it may not necessarily happen at home, particularly if we don't talk to parents about the power of revisiting.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We need to be coming to an end of our discussion now, which is a shame. And I've learned so much, and I just want to thank you for some of the ideas, and offer you an opportunity, perhaps to. I mean, there's so much come out of our conversation tonight, but I wanted to offer you the opportunity to kind of challenge us to go out into our centres and settings tomorrow. What could we do to really promote some intentional teaching and sustained shared thinking? And I'm aware that you've given us lots of ideas around storybook reading. Is there anything else you'd like to sell us as your final selling point tonight?
I'll give one, and I'm sure Sue will have another one. So we'll set 2 challenges.
Yeah, set us some challenges.
My challenge would be for teams, given it's Monday night, so we've got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, to purposefully and intentionally seek out every child in their setting for at least one extended conversation with a member of the teaching team. And
back and forth conversation,
back and forth conversation, asking the child questions about what they're doing, what they're thinking, and just being, and even if it doesn't go into extended thinking, being with and engaging with the child in a meaningful back and forth interaction around more than just daily management, because one of the things that I think is really important is that all children get these opportunities. And it's very easy for the children who opt in to teacher interactions to get more of these. But I would strongly encourage teams to be really quite mindful and thoughtful about how do we make sure we reach every child in our setting with this type of interaction.
And so my challenge would be around practicing reflecting in action. And I think lots of teachers will be doing that regularly, but when we first start to reflect in action, it often feels quite awkward. But for people my challenge would be to take some opportunities and moments over the rest of the week to, in the moment of the interaction, to have part of your brain sitting there thinking, now what's going on here? How might I be extending or supporting this? What are the cues that I'm getting back from this child that are telling me that what I'm doing is picking up and it's engaging them further, or no, it's off the mark and they're kind of losing interest, or it's not engaging them. So really practicing that in the moment reflection and analysis of my practice, so that, because I think the more that we can do it, and we can't do it all of the time, but the more we can do it, the better chance we have of being able to be intentional on a more ongoing basis.
Well, thank you very much. As I say, I've learned so much tonight, and I'm certainly going to be exploring the ideas of that rough and final draft speech this week, and just taking that time for meaningful dialogue and really trying to seek those interactions. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your wisdom and expertise, and we look forward to hearing more about this research that you're doing, and please do have a look at the Education Hub's resources on intentional teaching and things that we have if you're interested in more. So thank you very much for joining us tonight.